I just want to introduce Alli Condra, who is an associate at Davis Wright Tremaine. Davis Wright Tremaine is probably one of the country's leading law firms when it comes to food. They represent many entrepreneurial businesses as well as multinational businesses. I'm happy to say I've had a long-term professional relationship with them. They're very, very knowledgeable. And we wanted Alli today to talk to us about some of the pressures, constraints, opportunities, risks with respect to the way the plant-based food industry and product landscape is shaping up. So happy birthday, Alli, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me. I am pleased to be here and excited for all the things that you're learning and the ways that you are going to go out into the world and engage in the food industry in this way. So as Will said, I was asked to talk about regulatory issues facing plant-based food companies. And as you might guess, there are many regulatory considerations plant-based food companies and other food companies should be aware of. And in 10 minutes or so is just enough for a taste. I'm going to provide a high-level overview of a few of the topics that come up in my practice advising food companies and plant-based food companies on regulatory issues. So we're going to talk about statements of identity, claims, and the concept of generally recognized as safe. But first, it's important to know that the primary law governing the manufacture and sale of packaged food in the US is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FDCA, and the regulations set forth by the Food and Drug Administration. The United States Department of Agriculture also plays a big role in the regulation of food in the US, but because it regulates meat products, I'm not going to really talk about sort of the USDA and its role in this space, even though it's kind of there's some overlap in interests here. So it is a violation of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act for a food to be misbranded or adulterated. And those are both defined terms in statute, and they have lots of subparts. So you'll often hear those terms thrown around, and they're kind of like the two pillars of what we think about when talking about regulatory issues. So at its most basic, a food is misbranded if its labeling is false or misleading in any particular, and a food is adulterated if it bears or contains any poisonous or deleterious substance which may render it injurious to health. So kind of think about those things, keep them in the back of your mind as we go through this. Before we get into some of the details about the three issues I raised earlier, I want to explain why FDA regulatory issues matter. So regulatory compliance matters not only to avoid enforcement actions by the FDA or a state agency, but also because there are a number of plaintiffs' attorneys and industry groups who focus on food labeling matters in particular. So my job and our job as a law firm at Davis Wright Tremaine is to help food companies and plant-based food companies understand and mitigate the risks associated with food safety and food labeling and advertising. And in this industry, as things continue to develop, there is just a lot of risk mitigation that we talk about. So people often think that regulatory compliance is black and white, right? Like I thought that when I got into this, I was like, there are rules, you just think about the rules, you read the rules, and then you have an answer. But the reality is that regulatory interpretation is not often black and white. I joke that my clients manage to find the cracks in the regulations. And so we often are like, well, here's what we think it means. Here's how we think it applies to you. You know, what is your risk tolerance? How much risk are you willing to take on any particular issue, particularly around labeling? There is a lot of interpretation and trying to figure out how we can adjust to minimize risk for companies. So with that brief background, let's dive into statements of identity. And I wish we were in person so I could see you all raise your hands, like how many of you know what statements of identity are, but just, you know, by yourselves, raise your hand if you're familiar. But if you're not familiar, every food product, every packaged food product must contain a statement of identity, which is like, what is the product at its most basic? And the FDA has established a number of standards of identity. And standards of identity are federal definitions for certain food products, such as milk, yogurt, macaroni products like macaroni, spaghetti, and vermicelli, fruit butter, fruit jelly, and jam, among many other products. There are a lot of standards of identity. So if a product meets a particular standard of identity, the name must be used on the label. And if a product uses a standardized term, it needs to meet the requirements of that applicable standard of identity. There's a big asterisk here, which we'll come back to in a minute. If there is no applicable standard of identity, then the statement of identity will be an established common or usual name if there is one, an appropriately descriptive term, or a fanciful name commonly used by the public if the nature of the food is obvious. That is not my language, that is what the regulation says, and it is such a funny thing. Fanciful name commonly used by the public. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, as you are well aware, either before you came to this session or now that you've been here for a little over half a day, there is a wide variety of existing and possible plant-based food products. And some plant-based food products may have statements of identity that aren't specifically related to their plant-based nature. For example, the nutrition bar. Other plant-based food products may be more closely related to products that have existing standards of identity. For example, milk and yogurt and ice cream. And whether plant-based food products can use a qualified standardized term, so qualified to indicate the plant-based nature of the product, like almond milk, has been the subject of a lot of discussion, debate, and litigation over the last number of years. FDA's enforcement on standards of identity has not been robust, particularly robust on this issue recently. They kind of dabble in and out of this space, but have been largely silent lately. However, a number of states like Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Georgia have introduced and passed laws restricting plant-based foods' use of terms related to animal products such as burger. Although interestingly, a number of those laws allow plant-based food companies to use those terms related to animal products if the labels clearly indicate that the products are plant-based or vegan. So in our practice, remember, labels have to be truthful and not misleading. And so if you're selling a plant-based product, you want to convey that to consumers, So it's just an interesting carve out that if you indicate very clearly that the product is plant-based or vegan, then these laws apparently carve you out. But it's just an interesting development that a number of states have decided to pass laws on these issues. So in addition to the state laws, there are ongoing litigation over these issues, and it remains to be seen how the litigation will resolve and whether the FDA will step in to update its regulations to clarify this issue. All right, the second issue we're going to talk about today that plant companies need to be aware of are the regulations governing claims that can be made about the plant-based food products. And this is not particularly specific to plant-based food products, but it's important because plant-based food companies may want to tout the characteristics and or benefits of their products. And there are a lot of regulations governing claims. So claims must be truthful, not misleading, and substantiated. And we'll talk a little bit more about the substantiation piece later. So first, FDA allows companies to make claims about the nutrient content of the products. For example, claims about the amount of fiber or sugar or calories. But you can't make any claim, just any claim that you want about the nutrient content. So the FDA has defined a number of nutrient content claims, such as low calorie and excellent source of vitamin C, but has not defined all nutrient content claims. For example, the claim low sugar is not allowed because the FDA has not yet defined what it means to be low in sugar. And in addition, there are rules about disclaimers and placement and prominence of claims that are worth paying attention to. And this is a subject of quite a bit of litigation, so it's worth paying attention to. Second, companies may also want to talk about the health benefits of their products, and this can present risk for companies. The FDA allows food companies to make structure function claims, that is, claims about the effect of a dietary ingredient or nutrient on the healthy structure or function of the body. For example, calcium builds strong bones. And structure function claims on food, as compared to dietary supplements, are limited to claims about the nutritive effects of the dietary ingredient or the nutrient, whereas dietary supplements are allowed to talk about the non-nutritive effects in addition. So this makes people's heads spin a little bit. Sometimes it makes my head spin a little bit because there's not a lot of guidance from the FDA about where those lines are, about what exactly is the nutritive effect of a dietary ingredient or nutrient. And one risk with structure function claims is that they can come close to being classified as drug claims. And a drug is a product that is intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease or other health-related condition. So there's a lot of gray, there's a spectrum, and you just want to be very mindful about talking about the health benefits and other benefits of products so that you don't inadvertently wander into an unapproved drug claim. And earlier I mentioned that claims must be truthful, not misleading, and substantiated. And the substantiated part is really important here when talking about structure function claims. So even if a company gets comfortable with a particular claim that we think qualifies as a structure function claim, does the company have evidence and documentation that the claim is true and that, for example, the amount of dietary ingredient in the product is sufficient to have the claimed effect? And the last regulatory concept I'll mention today is what's known as generally recognized as safe or GRAS. And again, if we were in person, I'd have you raise your hand to see how many of you have ever heard of this term and this concept. But at its most basic, any substance that is added to food is a food additive unless it is generally recognized as safe for its intended use. And for any substance that was not commonly used in food prior to January 1st, 1958, the way that a substance can be determined to be generally recognized as safe has to be through scientific procedures to show that the substance is safe under its conditions of its intended use. And GRAS has been the subject of some debate over the years because the GRAS process allows a company to determine on its own whether a substance is generally recognized as safe for its intended use. And unlike food additives that must go through a formal approval process, substances that are GRAS do not need to be reported or approved by the FDA. So companies may provide a notice to the FDA of their conclusion that a substance is GRAS, but are not required to. If a GRAS notice is submitted to the FDA, the ideal outcome is that the FDA responds with a no questions letter. And while this is not formal approval of the substance, it is FDA's tacit acceptance that the substance is generally recognized as safe for its intended use as outlined in the notice. So why does this matter to plant-based food companies? Well, a plant-based food company may want to use an ingredient that hasn't been used before in the United States, or it may want to use an existing ingredient in a new way or in a new amount. In those cases, it's important to confirm that the substance is generally recognized as safe for its intended use. We ask questions such as, has the supplier of the substance conducted its own analysis and concluded that the product is safe for the specific intended use? Sometimes they get really specific, like this substance is allowed in gum, or this substance is allowed in caffeinated beverages in a certain amount. So it's important to be very specific about a substance's intended use. And you can also ask whether there is an existing GRAS notice that a company can rely on. Hi.
Hi, I'm back.
Okay, I was almost done, but
I'm just going to be here to ask you a question as soon as you're done.
Okay, great. So understanding whether a substance is GRAS is very important, and there are a number of ways to do that. Some substances that are GRAS are identified in FDA regulations, and some are identified on the FDA's website, but not all substances that are GRAS will be listed in regulations or on the FDA's website. So the risk of not confirming that a substance is GRAS is that it can be considered an unapproved food additive, and there could be a violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and a potential recall. So GRAS is a very important concept to keep in mind for plant-based food companies as they move forward. And there are numerous other FDA regulatory issues and non-FDA related, but related to labeling and safety regulations that plant-based food companies should keep in mind. And so we, of course, recommend that food companies engage an attorney to help them understand the variety of risks and mitigation techniques as you enter this industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Alli, and happy birthday again. In that beautifully articulated, intense briefing, and I just want to remind everyone, it was a briefing.
Yeah.
You covered a lot of ground, and you also, I think, proved that the career path you chose was a smart one. So for any of the students that are really intrigued with this, you can imagine that the legal profession is going to be incredibly busy in the years to come as this industry evolves, because it's really transformational in terms of the current way the laws are written. And, you know, with that in mind, we only have a few minutes, but I thought I have sort of two questions that wrap into a lot of things people have been talking about. One is standards of identity, milk and meat. I mean, these are words that are now in the names of companies, on their products. Is it going to be at a state level, or is there going to be national legislation, or how do you predict that whole thing is going to play out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hope that the FDA will step in. I mean, as I said, a number of states, passed laws that said, you can't use these words, you can't call a plant-based food product meat, except if you qualify it. And so for me, that's sort of what we've been advising clients to do anyway. Plant-based food company doesn't want to call its product meat if it is and not qualify that it's plant-based. Like, the whole point is that it's plant-based. But because businesses, companies do business in all 50 states, it is really frustrating if you have different requirements. And we find this in the alcohol space. We find this in
it's like the EU.
Yeah. And so I'd hope that I imagine our litigators are excited to challenge and say that state laws are preempted by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act by adding additional requirements that are not required at the federal level. But the FDA sort of started engaging in this discussion again a few years ago, and they've just kind of they're not really active. So we'll see. I hope we get federal clarification for the sake of food companies.
One last question: where should students go to go deeper? What resources would you point them to? Obviously, not to replace the need for a trained professional in this area, just to learn more. Should we just go to your website? Is there the FDA? I mean, where should we look for more info?
Yeah, so I think, our website, and I'm happy to talk to folks, the FDA's website in terms of standards of identity gives very high level, you're not going to really get deep into these issues, but in terms of general labeling, they have a lot of guidance documents. I think even just good old Google searches find a lot of resources from various industry groups that are following these issues as well.
But I always encourage emergent entrepreneurs, always start with a good lawyer, counselor, partner. So Alli, Condra, happy birthday.
Thank you.
What a great briefing. Really appreciate it.